She had $47 in her wallet, a single rolling suitcase, and a particular kind of stillness that comes not from peace, but from having already cried every tear available to a person. The bus stop bench was cold aluminum, and the November air carried the smell of exhaust and damp leaves, and Miriam Calloway sat at the precise center of it as though she had been placed there deliberately, as though the universe had set her down in that exact spot to see what she would do next. She was 34 years old. She had a master's degree in architectural design. And 3 hours ago, she had walked out of the house that bore her name on the mortgage, but had never, not for a single day of the last 4 years, felt like her home. The Maybach appeared at the far end of Calloway Street, which was, by the way, named for her great-grandfather, a fact that her ex-husband's family had always found either amusing or infuriating, depending on the occasion, and it moved with the unhurried confidence of something that had never needed to rush. Black, immaculate, the kind of vehicle that doesn't drive so much as glide, as though the road itself has extended a particular courtesy. Miriam watched it, the way you watch weather that doesn't concern you. She had other things on her mind. She had, specifically, $47, a sister in Phoenix who didn't know she was coming, and the question of whether the 4:15 bus would be on time. The car stopped directly in front of her. Not near her, in front of her, with a precision that suggested intention rather than accident. The driver's window descended, and a man perhaps 60 years old, with silver-threaded hair cut close and a face assembled from dignified angles, looked at her with an expression she didn't immediately recognize. It was not pity. It was not the particular patronizing concern of a stranger who has decided you need help. It was something older and more complicated. Recognition. "Miss Calloway," he said, "my name is Gerald Hurst. I was your grandfather's driver for 11 years. He asked me to find you when the time came. I believe the time has come. Before we go any further, if you've ever been counted out by people who should have known better, if you've ever sat in a cold place carrying a secret the world hadn't learned yet, stay with the story. Leave a comment telling me where you're watching from. And if this is your first time here, subscribe, because we tell stories about what happens when the people who underestimated you finally understand the size of their mistake." Miriam did not get into the car immediately. That detail matters. She sat very still for approximately 4 seconds, which is a long time if you count it, and looked at Gerald Hurst with the careful assessment of a woman who has recently learned that trust is an architectural decision, not an emotional one. She was checking the structure, looking for load-bearing weaknesses. "My grandfather passed away 8 months ago," she said. "Yes, ma'am, he did. He left everything to a charitable trust. It was in the will." It was read by an attorney in front of the whole family. Gerald Hurst's expression did not change in any way that could be called dramatic. It was a small adjustment, the way light changes when a cloud moves, subtle, but altering everything. "There was a second will," he said, "and a letter, both of which, Mr. Juror Calloway asked me to deliver to you personally and privately, at a time when he believed you would need them most." He paused. He was, if I may say so, a very perceptive man. Miriam looked down at her suitcase. She looked at the number 47 she had mentally stamped onto her day. She looked up the street in the direction the 4:15 would come from if it came on time, which it generally did not. Then she stood, took hold of her suitcase, and got into the car. The interior smelled of leather and something faintly cedar-like, and the quiet inside was the kind of quiet that costs money. Not silence exactly, but the complete absence of the world's intrusions. Gerald pulled smoothly into traffic, and Miriam sat with her hands folded in her lap and tried to decide whether she was experiencing hope or simply the temporary suspension of despair. She was not yet certain there was a meaningful difference. Let us go back. Because to understand what was waiting for Miriam Calloway in that car, in that letter, in the second will that no one in her family knew existed, you have to understand what had been done to her, and by whom, and over what, careful, sustained, and insulting length of time. Her grandfather, Edward Calloway, had built his construction and property development business from a single contract in 1971, a modest municipal drainage project that he completed on time, under budget, and with a standard of care that the city engineers still referenced decades later. He was not a flashy man. He was not a man who wore his success as though it were a costume. He drove reasonable cars, ate at restaurants where the prices were not obscene, and believed, with a conviction bordering on religious, that the quality of a person was demonstrated entirely through their work and their word, in that order. He had one daughter, Miriam's mother, Patricia, and through Patricia he had one grandchild, Miriam. There had been a son, Edward Jr., who had died of a cardiac event at 51, leaving behind a wife named Constance and two adult children, Derek and Leanne. These three, Constance, Derek, and Leanne, are the architecture of our antagonist, not the sharp-cornered kind of villain that announces itself, the smooth, load-bearing kind, the kind built into the structure so thoroughly that you almost mistake them for support. Constance Calloway had married into the family 30 years ago with the particular ambition of someone who understands that belonging to something is less valuable than owning it. When Edward Jr. died and left the field open, she moved with admirable efficiency. She inserted herself into every conversation Edward Sr. had about the business. She positioned Derek, charming, impeccably groomed, and substantially less capable than he appeared, as the natural heir to the company. She cultivated in the old man a narrative that Patricia's branch of the family, the quiet branch, the branch that produced an architect who worked for other people's firms rather than building dynasties, was the lesser branch, the decorative branch, the one you invited to holidays but didn't trust with real decisions. Miriam had understood this narrative for years. She had watched it being constructed around her like scaffolding on a building that wasn't hers. What she had not understood until the day of her grandfather's funeral was how completely and deliberately she had been erased from the version of the family story that Constance had been telling Edward for the final 2 years of his life. The funeral itself had been a masterwork of subtle exclusion. Constance had arranged everything. Constance had written the program. Constance had selected the speakers, chosen the music, approved the flowers, and organized the reception at the Calloway estate, the large one, the one with the formal gardens that Edward Sr. had always said he found pretentious but had never gotten around to selling. Miriam had arrived with her then-husband Marcus and found that she was seated in the third row, third, as though she were a business associate rather than his only grandchild. Through his surviving child, she had said nothing. That was Miriam's particular discipline. She did not react to provocations designed to make her react. She sat in the third row and listened to Derek deliver a eulogy that described Edward Calloway as a man whose greatest pride had been his son, Edward Jr., and his son's children, and his son's family's stewardship of everything he'd built. She sat and listened to the careful omission of her name, her mother's name, their entire branch of the family tree pruned out of the public record of his life as efficiently as if they had never grown there. Marcus had leaned over and whispered something meant to be comforting. It was not. But that is a separate problem, and it became a much more urgent problem over the following months, as the marriage that had always been slightly too small for Miriam began to collapse under pressures that were partly financial and partly the accumulated weight of being with someone who consistently, cheerfully failed to see her clearly. Will reading had taken place 6 weeks after the funeral. A firm downtown neutral ground, the family assembled in a conference room with water pitchers and an attorney named Halverson, who had the practiced neutrality of a man paid to deliver information without opinion. The will was thorough. The charitable trust received the majority of the estate. Constance received the family home and a generous ongoing allowance drawn from a separately established fund. Derek received a 20% operating stake in Calloway Construction and Development, along with an executive title. Leanne received a lump sum and the contents of Edward's art collection. Patricia, Miriam's mother, received a parcel of land in upstate New York that the family had always considered low value, and a personal letter that Halverson handed to her in a sealed envelope. Miriam received nothing. Not a reduced share, not a symbolic gesture, nothing. As though Halverson had moved from one name to the next and simply skipped the space where hers should have been. Constance had not smiled. That would have been too visible. She had arranged her expression into something that read as dignified solemnity, with just enough softening around the eyes to suggest she found this sad rather than satisfying. Derek had looked at the table. Leanne had looked at her phone. Miriam had looked at the window. Outside, the street continued its ordinary business. A delivery truck double-parked. A woman pushed a stroller. The world declined to pause for the moment. She had driven home. She had told Marcus. Marcus had said, with the particular thoughtlessness of someone who doesn't understand what they're revealing, "Well, it makes sense that he'd leave it to the side of the family that was actually involved in the business." He had then asked what was for dinner. That exchange lived in Miriam's memory with extraordinary clarity, and it did considerable work over the following months in clarifying what she needed to do about her marriage. What she did ultimately was recognize it. She spent 4 more months attempting to renovate something that was not structurally sound. Then she stopped. She was methodical about it. She is an architect, and architects understand that you do not begin demolition without a plan for what comes after. She documented. She organized. She protected what she had independently built, which was not nothing. She had 7 years at a respected firm, a portfolio of completed projects, and a professional reputation built entirely through her own capability, without the Calloway name opening a single door. Because, in her industry, no one connected her to the construction family. She had always been Miriam, the architect, not Miriam Calloway, the heiress. The separation from Marcus had been quiet. The day she left, she had taken 1 suitcase, deliberately, symbolically, because she believed in the principle that you should be able to carry what matters. She had sat down at the bus stop on Calloway Street, and she had $47 and a ticket to Phoenix and a sister who didn't know she was coming. And she had not yet cried today, which she considered a reasonable achievement. And then the Maybach had stopped, and Gerald Hurst had said her name. In the back of the car, Gerald handed her a mahogany box, small, the size of a shoebox, with a brass latch that had been polished recently. Inside, resting on green felt, were 2 envelopes and a key. The key was ordinary-looking, silver, small, the kind that opens a safe deposit box rather than a grand estate. Miriam lifted the first envelope. It was sealed with wax, old-fashioned, burgundy, bearing the impression of the Calloway Company seal. Her grandfather's handwriting on the front was still vigorous, the letters architectural in their precision. It said, "For Miriam." "When you're ready." She opened it. Gerald drove. He did not look in the mirror. He gave her the privacy of forward motion, the city moving past the windows like a painting being slowly scrolled, and Miriam read. Edward Calloway had written 4 pages in longhand, and they constituted the most honest document she had ever received from a member of her family. He wrote that he was sorry, not in a general, graceful way. Specifically sorry for the funeral seating, which he had learned about from Gerald afterward and had been furious about, for the years of allowing Constance's narrative to stand unchallenged at family gatherings. For the will that had been drawn up under conditions he was only now, in this letter written 3 months before his death, prepared to name clearly. He had been, he wrote, in the grip of a sustained and skillfully managed campaign of information control that had taken him too long to recognize for what it was. Constance had shown him documents. Messages, purportedly from Miriam and Patricia, expressing disinterest in the business and contempt for him personally. He had believed them because he had been tired and grieving his son, and because Constance had always known precisely how to position a story. He had discovered the forgeries through an accident, A real message from Patricia, written in her actual voice, placed accidentally next to one of the fabricated ones, and the difference in tone had been so stark that he had looked more carefully and then called a handwriting analyst, quietly, without telling anyone in the family. The analyst had been unambiguous. The documents Constance had shown him were not written by the people who supposedly wrote them. He had then, also quietly, revised his will, not the one Halverson had read. A second one, executed with a different attorney, a woman named Delphine Okafor, whose card was paper-clipped to the second envelope and witnessed by Gerald Hurst and one other person. Under Georgia law, a later executed valid will supersedes an earlier one, and this one had been prepared with meticulous attention to that legal standard. Delphine Okafor had been practicing estate law for 28 years. She did not make procedural errors. The second will left Callaway Construction and Development to Miriam, not a share, the controlling interest, 60% of the company, including all executive authority. The remaining 40% was divided equally among Patricia, Derek, and Leanne, which meant that each of the three held approximately 13 1/3%, and Constance held nothing, because Constance had already received the family home and the allowance, and Edward Callaway, once he understood what had been done to his family, had proven to be a man capable of very precise and very proportional justice. The key opened a safe deposit box at a bank downtown that contained the original signed documents, a USB drive with the handwriting analyst's full report, and records of every forged communication Constance had fabricated over a 2-year period. Not circumstantial evidence. A documented, organized record assembled by a man who had spent 50 years in the construction industry, which is to say, a man who understood that you do not begin a project without solid foundations, and you do not finish one without inspection. Miriam read all 4 pages. She read them twice. Then she sat back against the leather seat of the Maybach and looked out the window at the city, which continued its ordinary business, and she thought about the word ready, which her grandfather had written on the envelope. When you're ready, and she understood that he had known something about her that she was only now confirming for herself, that she would not have been ready before this moment, before the marriage had clarified itself. Before she had sat on a cold bench with $47 and proved to herself that she could hold stillness under pressure. Before she had demonstrated to no audience whatsoever that she did not collapse. She was 34 years old. She had a master's degree in architectural design, and apparently she owned a construction company. "Gerald," she said. "Yes, Miss Callaway. Did you know what was in the will when you were looking for me?" "I knew the general shape of it," he said. "Mr. Callaway was not secretive with me about his intentions. He was secretive about the timing. He wanted me to find you when the time came. He was very specific about that phrase. He said you'd know what it meant." She did know what it meant. She sat with it for a moment. The knowledge, the weight, the particular quality of being seen accurately by someone who is no longer present to be thanked. She would have to carry that gratitude somewhere else. She decided she would carry it forward. Delphine Okafor's office was on the 14th floor of a building downtown, and she was a woman of perhaps 60, with reading glasses on a beaded chain and an expression of settled intelligence that reminded Miriam, unexpectedly, of her grandfather. She welcomed Miriam without theatrics, simply stood, extended her hand, and said, "I've been waiting 8 months for this appointment. Your grandfather said you'd arrive when you were ready." He was, by the way, consistently correct about things like that. She gestured to a chair. "Shall we begin?" They began. Okafor walked Miriam through the legal mechanics with the calm precision of someone who has explained complicated things to people in complicated emotional states many times and has learned that clarity is the highest form of kindness. The second will was valid. It had been filed with the probate court 6 months ago, immediately after Constance's will had been submitted for probate, because Okafor had been monitoring for that filing, as instructed, though the filing of the later executed will had initiated a legal contest that was now formally underway. Constance's attorney had received notification 3 weeks ago. Constance knows? Miriam said. Constance's attorney knows, Okafor said, making the distinction with the precision of a woman who understood that these were not the same thing. Whether Constance herself has been fully briefed on the implications, I cannot say. But the formal contest is a matter of record. Miriam absorbed this, and the forgeries are part of the probate proceeding as exhibits. Okafor set her glasses on the desk with a small, deliberate motion. Mrs. Calloway, I want to be clear with you about something. Your grandfather did not build this case to be cruel. He built it because he believed that the truth about what was done to your family should be part of the record, not a private grievance, a documented fact. She paused. That said, what you choose to do with controlling interest in the company and what position you take regarding any potential criminal referral for the forgeries is entirely your decision. A criminal referral. Miriam had not yet arrived at that concept. She sat with it briefly, turned it over, examined its weight. Forgery, document fraud. A sustained 2-year campaign of manufactured evidence designed to disinherit a living person from her family's legacy. The legal exposure, Okafor confirmed, was not trivial. Miriam did not make any decisions that day. That was one of the things she was most proud of later, that she did not, in the first hours of understanding her position, make any decisions from the emotional altitude of the moment. She was an architect. She knew you draw plans before you build. She asked Gerald to take her to a hotel. A modest one, she specified, and he complied without comment, though she noticed the slight adjustment in his expression that suggested he was recalibrating his expectation. She checked in with $47 and a credit card and a mahogany box. She ordered room service. She called her sister in Phoenix and said, "I'm not coming. Something's happened. I'll explain soon." And then she slept properly for the first time in longer than she could accurately remember. 3 weeks later, on a Tuesday morning in December, Miriam Calloway walked into the headquarters of Calloway Construction and Development. The building was on the west side, a structure that her grandfather had designed. Not himself, but he'd had deep input into the design, with a lobby of polished concrete and steel, and a reception desk behind which a young woman named Candace looked up with the standard professional welcome of someone greeting a visitor whose importance she has not yet assessed. Miriam was dressed in charcoal. She had her portfolio under one arm and her attorney's documentation under the other. And she had spent 3 weeks doing exactly what she knew how to do, working. She had reviewed 5 years of the company's financial records, which Okafor had obtained through the probate proceeding. She had read project files. She had toured 3 current job sites, not identifying herself, simply looking at the work with the eye of someone who knows what good construction looks like. The company was operationally sound. Derek had not destroyed it, which was somewhat to his credit, though Miriam suspected that the middle managers her grandfather had installed over the years deserved most of the acknowledgement. She had also, over those 3 weeks, made her decision about the criminal referral. She would not pursue it. She would make this choice not because she forgave what had been done. She was honest enough with herself to know she was not there yet, but because she had examined her grandfather's intention and understood that the truth being on the record was what mattered to him. The document, the fact, not the punishment. She could live with that distinction. What she would do and did was the following. She called a meeting. Okafor sent the formal notice to all interested parties, which in this case meant Derek, Leanne, and Constance, along with their respective legal representatives. The meeting was to be held at the company's conference room on the 4th floor. The subject was listed with legal precision as transfer of controlling interest pursuant to the estate of Edward James Calloway, executed will dated the 14th of March, per Georgia probate proceeding case number, and then the number, which meant nothing to anyone who hadn't been following along, and everything to the 3 people who had. Constance did not bring her attorney. Miriam would later learn that the attorney had advised strongly against attending without counsel, and Constance had overruled him, which was consistent with the portrait emerging from the documents, a woman who trusted her own performance above all other strategies. She arrived in a winter coat the color of champagne, with Leanne behind her and Derek slightly ahead, because Derek had always known how to enter a room, even when he wasn't sure why he was in it. The coat was, Miriam thought, a very particular choice, the costume of someone who expected to remain in command of the proceedings. Miriam was already seated at the head of the table. This is the detail that Leanne would describe later to a number of people as the moment she understood something had fundamentally changed. Not the legal documents on the table, not the presence of Okafor beside Miriam. The fact that Miriam was at the head of the table, sitting with the comfortable stillness of someone who had already decided what was going to happen. Constance looked at the seating arrangement for a fraction of a second, then arranged her face and sat down. "Thank you for coming," Miriam said. "Tess." Constance said, "I think you should understand that my attorney has raised significant procedural questions about the validity of this entire proceeding." Her voice was level, authoritative, carrying the register of a woman accustomed to managing rooms. "Your attorney raised those questions in his initial response," Miriam said. "Miss S." Okafor addressed them in her reply, dated November 22nd. The court agreed. "We're past that stage." A small silence. "The purpose of this meeting," Miriam continued, "is not to litigate. Ms. Beau want as Okafor can speak to the legal position in any level of detail you need. The purpose is to discuss the path forward for the company, because whatever your feelings about the probate proceeding, Callaway Construction has ongoing projects, employees, contracts, and clients, and they don't pause for family disagreements." Derek said carefully, "What exactly are you proposing?" "I'm not proposing," Miriam said, with a mildness that was the exact opposite of weakness. "I'm informing. My grandfather left me controlling interest in this company. I intend to exercise that interest. You, Derek, retain your 13.5% and your current operational role under a revised employment agreement that reflects the new governance structure. Leanne, same terms applied to your stake." She paused. "I have no interest in removing either of you from the company. My grandfather built this company over 50 years. I'm not going to dismantle his work. I'm going to build on it." Leanne said quietly, "And our mother?" Miriam looked at Constance. Constance was looking at a point, somewhere above Miriam's shoulder, the expression of someone refusing to acknowledge that the center of gravity in the room has shifted. It was, Miriam thought, a valiant effort. "Your mother retains everything. The first will granted her," Miriam said. "The house, the allowance. Those were my grandfather's gifts to her, and I honor them." She let the sentence land without anything attached to it because nothing needed to be attached to it. Everyone in the room could hear what lived inside the restraint. What Miriam did not do, and this requires emphasis because it matters to the shape of the story and to the kind of person Miriam Callaway actually was mention the forgeries, not in the meeting, not to Derek and Leanne. They would learn about them through the probate proceeding, through their attorneys, through the documentary record that was now part of the public file. They would make their own decisions about what it meant and what relationship they wanted with their mother going forward. That was not Miriam's architecture to design. She had built what she needed to build, and she was going to let the rest stand or fall on its own structural integrity. Constance spoke once more at the end of the meeting as people were gathering their things. She said, and it came out with less force than she'd intended, the coating of authority having worn thin by then, "Your grandfather would not have wanted this." Miriam stood and picked up her portfolio and looked at Constance with an expression that was neither triumph nor anger, something more complicated, something that had grief in it alongside everything else. "My grandfather," she said, "is the one who arranged it. So I think he would have been at peace with it. She walked out. The months that followed were not a triumphant montage. They were work. Substantial, detailed, sometimes tedious, frequently difficult work, because that is what running a construction company actually involves. And Miriam was not the kind of person who confused the dramatic pivot point with the destination. The pivot point is not the destination. The pivot point is where you choose your direction. The destination is built slowly through everything that comes after. She brought in 2 project managers from her firm and promoted 3 people already inside the company whose capability the existing leadership structure had, in her assessment, substantially underutilized. She spent 4 months conducting a full operational review, not because anything was critically wrong, but because she believed you do not take stewardship of something without understanding it completely. She reviewed every active contract. She met with every site supervisor. She walked every active build. She also visited her mother. Patricia Calloway lived in a house in Decatur that she had purchased herself on a teacher's salary, supplemented eventually by a counseling practice. And when Miriam arrived on a Sunday with the mahogany box and her grandfather's letter, Patricia had not yet read it, had not known it existed. They sat at the kitchen table for 4 hours. Patricia read. She set the letter down. She picked it up. She read it again. Then she cried, in the way of someone releasing something that had been held at considerable cost for a very long time. And Miriam sat beside her and held her hand and did not say anything, because there was nothing to say that the letter had not already said, and said better. The parcel of land in upstate New York, which the family had dismissed as low value at the will reading, turned out to be a more interesting asset than anyone had assessed. Miriam ran a proper evaluation 6 months after the probate settlement. It was part of the estate's property review, and discovered that the land had development potential that had been deliberately undervalued in the estate documentation presented to the family. It was, in fact, worth approximately 4 times what it had been represented as. Whether this misrepresentation had been an error or a strategy was a question Miriam handed to Okafor with the instruction to investigate quietly and thoroughly. The results of that investigation are part of a separate civil proceeding that, as of the telling of this story, remains ongoing. These things move slowly. The law is not a Maybach. It does not glide. But it arrives eventually at its destination. Derek and Miriam found an equilibrium that surprised them both. He was, she discovered, genuinely skilled in client relations, a talent he had always possessed, but that had been submerged inside the performance of importance that Constance had encouraged. Without that performance to maintain, without the pressure of being the designated heir to something he hadn't earned, Derek became easier to be around and, more significantly, easier to work with. He was never going to be her confidant, but he was a competent and increasingly honest colleague. She could build with that. Leanne she saw less often. Leanne was working through her own reckoning quietly, in the way of someone who had been complicit in something smaller than their mother's central betrayal, but large enough to sit uncomfortably with. They had lunch twice. Both times, Leanne said things that were approximately half honest, and Miriam accepted that and waited, because she understood that honesty is also something people build toward, and some people build slowly. Constance she did not see at all, not for a long time. What she heard through Derek, through the slow circulation of family information, was that Constance had moved into the family home that the will had secured for her and had become, over the months, quieter. Not chastened, exactly. Constance was not, Miriam suspected, constitutionally capable of the kind of surrender that genuine chastening requires, but quieter. The energy required to manage a narrative that no longer had any leverage was apparently substantial, and Constance appeared to have found it easier for now to rest. Gerald Hurst retired 6 months after the probate settlement, and Miriam gave a speech at his retirement gathering that made 3 of the senior managers cry, which she had not anticipated. She thanked him for his 11 years of loyalty to her grandfather and for his 5-month stewardship of the task he had been left, and for the particular quality of grace with which he had appeared at a bus stop on a November afternoon and said her name. She did not mention the $47. That was hers to keep. She still has the mahogany box. It sits on the windowsill of her office on the 4th floor of Callaway Construction and Development, in a building on the west side of the city, and the light from that window is good in the mornings. She chose that office partly for the light because she is an architect, and architects think about light, and because her grandfather had used that office, and she wanted to sit where he had sat and understand the view he had looked at. The key is still inside it, though what it opens has long since been emptied and examined and accounted for. She keeps the box for the same reason. People keep things that have served their purpose but carried meaning. It is a reminder of the shape of the moment, of what readiness looks like. From the outside, when you are sitting on a cold bench holding very little, and a thing you cannot yet see is moving toward you. She is 35 now. Her firm, separate from the construction company, her own practice, the one she built herself before any of this, has taken on 3 new projects in the past year. She kept it separate deliberately. The Callaway Company is a stewardship. The architectural practice is a creation. Both matter. She has learned that you can honor what you inherit and still insist on building something of your own. The marriage is done. Cleanly, professionally, without drama, because Miriam does not do drama. She does documentation. Marcus signed what he was asked to sign. He has since, by all reports, found someone else to not see clearly, which is his business and not her problem. What remains, what she returns to when the day is long or the decisions are difficult, is the letter. 4 pages in her grandfather's architectural handwriting. The apology, the explanation, and the sentence she comes back to most, the one she has never shared publicly until this telling, the one that lives at the bottom of the 3rd page, almost an aside, written as though he wasn't sure whether to include it. You were always the one who was most like me, Miriam. I was a coward about saying so while I could. I am trying to say so. Now he had written it. She had read it on a moving car, on a November afternoon, with the city scrolling past the windows. And something had settled in her, not healed, not resolved, but settled. The way a foundation settles, the way a building, after the initial stress tests, finds its relationship with the ground it stands on and becomes still. There are people in your life who have decided what you are worth based on what they can see, which is always less than everything. They have made their assessment on incomplete information. They have built their confidence on a foundation that doesn't account for what you are doing quietly, steadily in the background, what you are becoming while they are busy being certain about you. The thing about that kind of certainty is that it doesn't update. It doesn't revise itself in response to new information. It simply stands there, confident and load-bearing, until the moment the actual structure is revealed, and then it doesn't fall dramatically. Most of the time, it just becomes, suddenly and permanently, irrelevant. Miriam Callaway was waiting at a bus stop with $47 and a rolling suitcase. She was, at that moment, the most powerful person on Callaway Street. She just hadn't received the documentation yet. The documentation arrived on time. It always does. If this story sat with you, if you recognize something in Miriam's patience, in her grandfather's letter, in the particular experience of being underestimated by people who should have seen you clearly, I want to know about it. Drop a comment below. Tell me where you're watching from. Tell me if you've ever been the person on the cold bench, holding more than anyone around you understood. I read every single one. And if you haven't subscribed yet, now is the moment. We are here every week with stories about the long game, about what happens when the truth finally catches up to the story someone else told about you. It always does. Subscribe and don't miss what's coming next.